The university auditorium gradually filled with students. Some were animatedly discussing the past weekend, some were trying to read notes for the upcoming lecture at the last minute, and some were simply sitting at their laptops, immersed in work. Classes were going on as usual that day, but there was something special in the air. Several students were whispering among themselves, glancing at one young man who was sitting quietly in the front row. His appearance at the university attracted attention from the very beginning. He tried to behave modestly, not to arouse unnecessary interest, but his last name spoke for itself. Some treated him with respect, some with prejudice, but he was used to such attention. The door to the classroom swung open and Professor Emily Clark walked in. A middle-aged woman with short dark hair, a formal suit and thin-framed glasses, she was known at the university for her liberal views and criticism of the former U.S. administration. Most students found her lectures interesting and informative, but many knew that if she had the opportunity to throw a caustic remark at the former president, she would never pass it up. "Good afternoon, students," she began, placing her folder on the table. "Today we have a difficult topic. I hope everyone is ready." The audience began to make noise. Someone closed their laptop, someone quickly took out a pen and notepad. Barron sat quietly, showing no sign that anything was bothering him. The professor began to explain the new material. Complex formulas, graphs, logarithmic equations appeared on the screen. She spoke in detail about the methods of solving them, emphasizing the complex points that required deep understanding. But soon, between the explanations, the first hints began. "Higher mathematics, my friends," she said with a slight smile, "is not something where you can get out of it with beautiful words. Here, logic and knowledge decide everything, and not famous names and family ties." Some in the audience nodded with a knowing grin, while others simply remained silent. Barron didn't react. He continued to listen attentively, taking notes in his notebook. "Understanding numbers is not an elite privilege," she continued. "It's something that requires hard work. It doesn't require money, connections, or a name. It requires intelligence." Someone glanced towards Barron, waiting for his reaction. But he continued to remain absolutely calm. When the theory was cleared up, the professor folded her hands and looked around the room. "Well, let's see who really understood the material. We need volunteers to solve some difficult examples." She turned her gaze to the audience, lingering on one person. "Mr. Trump, why don't you give it a try?" The audience froze. Some raised their eyebrows in surprise, others held their breath, waiting to see how he would react. But Barron was not embarrassed. He calmly closed his notebook, stood up and confidently walked to the board. Several students exchanged glances. It's not every day you see the son of a former president answering complex math questions in front of an entire classroom. Professor Clark smiled, but her eyes held a look of expectation of failure. "So let's get started," she said, writing a complex equation on the board. "Let's see how you can handle it." She took a step back, crossing her arms. Barron, without thinking, took the chalk and began to write. He had no doubt. His hand moved quickly and confidently, producing precise calculations. He instantly grasped the essence of the problem, made the necessary transformations, and confidently approached the answer. The audience began to liven up. For the first few seconds the students simply watched, but then they began to whisper. "Does he really understand what he's doing?" someone whispered. "Oh well, I guess I was just lucky." "No, look, he doesn't even stutter." A few minutes later, the final answer appeared on the board. Barron put the chalk on the shelf and turned to face the professor. "Is the answer correct?" he asked with an imperturbable face. Professor Clark froze. She didn't expect such a result. She walked up to the board, slowly ran her eyes over the calculations, then picked up the chalk and began checking each step. The students fell silent, awaiting her verdict. After a few minutes of silence, she stepped back. "Yes, that's right." She said it without emotion, but there was surprise in her eyes. The audience smiled. Barron didn't smile, didn't show any pride. He just waited for the next task. Professor Clark pressed her lips together and wrote out an even more complex equation. Well, maybe that was too easy. Let's see if you can handle it. But Barron didn't flinch here either. He picked up the chalk again and began to solve without wasting time thinking, changing the mood in the audience. Now everyone was watching with real interest. Even those who initially doubted his abilities now looked at him with respect. While the professor continued to throw up new, even more difficult problems, Barron calmly and methodically solved them, proving that he was not just the president's son, but a man with an outstanding mind. When the last problem was solved, he calmly turned around and asked the same question again. Is the answer correct? The professor didn't know what to say. She realized that her plan had failed. Barron wasn't just prepared, he was the best in the room. And although she was irritated, she could not dispute the obvious. Sit down, Mr. Trump, she said dryly. That's enough for today. Barron turned silently and headed back to his seat. But that was only the first round. The professor was not going to give up. Now she will move on to the next stage, theoretical questions, hoping that at least here she will be able to stump him. Barron calmly sat down in his seat, but the students' eyes were still on him. Some were whispering, some were exchanging glances, and some were even nodding approvingly, amazed at how confidently he had handled the tasks. However, Professor Clark was not about to give up. She folded her arms across her chest, trying to hide her irritation. This guy had just ruined her carefully laid plan to make him look incompetent, to show that he only had his place because of his last name. But instead, he had brilliantly solved all the problems, without the slightest hesitation. Okay. Maybe he just memorized the formulas. Let's see what he says if I start making the questions more complicated, she thought. She walked over to the board and erased the equations Barron had just solved. Okay, Mr. Trump, she said. But as you understand, higher mathematics is not just a set of formulas. It is logic, analytics, the ability to think outside the box. Let's see how you cope with this. She took a piece of chalk and wrote out a much more complex integral equation that even the best students in the room could not solve without preparation. Prove the theorem on the convergence of the series and use it to solve this integral, she said with a slight grin. Of course, if you know how to do it. A low hum went through the audience. Some of the students looked at each other knowingly. This example was far from the curriculum. Even those who were really good at math knew that solving it required a deeper understanding of the subject. Some expected Barron to finally lose his composure. But he didn't show it. He stood up slowly, picked up the chalk and began working on the equation. First he broke the problem down into parts, wrote down the main conditions, then applied the theorem the professor had talked about. His handwriting was clear and neat, his movements confident. He did not pause, did not hesitate, did not drag out time, as those who are not sure of the answer do. The audience became even quieter. The students held their breath as he methodically moved forward, simplifying the complex equation step by step. Professor Clark watched silently. A few minutes later, Barron finished writing the last calculation and put the chalk down. He turned to the audience and said, "Thus, the series converges, therefore, the integral has a finite value. This proves the theorem you mentioned." The defeat of the professor. Professor Clark was silent for a few seconds, her lips pressed together. She moved closer to the board, carefully checking the calculations, hoping to find even the slightest mistake. But there was no mistake. "Damn," one of the students muttered. "What the?" whispered the other. The professor couldn't believe it. She, a person with a PhD, had just tried to humiliate Barron, but he had brilliantly accomplished a task that would have been beyond the capabilities of most of the students in this room. But she wasn't going to back down. "Okay," she finally said, stepping back from the board. "You've done it. But let's see how well you know the theory itself." She turned to the audience and said, "So, Mr. Trump, since you are so confident in your knowledge, let's test you on the theoretical part." She paused, pushed her glasses up her nose and asked with a sly smile, "Prove the Cauchy criterion for the limit of a function. And explain in what cases it can be applied." Someone whistled again. This question was much more difficult. It was no longer about calculations, but about a deep understanding of a concept that is only taught in advanced calculus courses. Some students whispered quietly, others stopped even blinking as they looked at Barron. But he was not embarrassed. He turned to the board and calmly began to write down the proof, explaining it in simple, understandable language. A few minutes later, the professor had a detailed answer in front of him, strict, logical, impeccable. Barron turned to her and said, "The Cauchy criterion allows one to determine the convergence of a sequence or function without directly calculating the limit. It is especially useful in cases where standard methods do not provide a simple solution." Professor Clark finally admitted defeat. She exhaled slowly, looked at him, and said in a restrained voice, "The answer is correct. You may sit down." The audience buzzed. Some smiled, some shook their heads in disbelief, but everyone present understood one thing. This guy just put one of the university's strictest professors in his place. Barron sat back calmly, not showing an ounce of smugness. For him, this was a normal thing. He wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone, he was just answering questions. But Professor Clark couldn't accept it. She took a deep breath, looked up, and said, "Well, we have seen that Mr. Trump understands mathematics. But let's see how he copes with other sciences. For example, with jurisprudence." The audience froze again. It was now clear that she was not just trying to test his knowledge, but to move on to a discussion of politics and the Trump family. But Barron was ready for anything. And at this point, the real game was just beginning. After Barron performed brilliantly on the math problems, Professor Clark decided to change tactics. She realized that trying to catch him on complex calculations was pointless. He knew the material no worse than the teachers, and perhaps even better than some. But now she had to test another level of knowledge. She paused, adjusted her glasses, and glanced around the audience. "Well," she said, "we've established that Mr. Trump can solve problems. But math isn't just about arithmetic, right? It's also about understanding concepts in depth. So let's see how well he understands the subject itself." She turned to Barron, who sat calmly, an expression of complete composure on his face. "Do you mind, Mr. Trump, if we continue?" He looked up and, without changing his expression, said, "Of course." The professor smiled slightly, but it was not a friendly smile. Rather, it was the predatory smile of someone who wants to catch their opponent in a mistake. She took a step to the side and said, "Name the main axioms of mathematical analysis and explain what role they play in the construction of modern mathematical logic." There was silence in the audience. The students tensed up because the question was far from easy. It touched on the fundamentals of the subject, and even many excellent students would not be able to answer it right away. But Barron didn't blink or think for a second. He stood up calmly, turned to the audience, and began. "The basic axioms of mathematical analysis include the axiom of completeness of real numbers, the axiom of Archimedes, the axioms of Dedekind, and a number of other postulates that form the basis of numerical systems. Their significance lies in the fact that without them, a rigorous mathematical justification of limits, derivatives, and integrals is impossible. For example, the axiom of completeness states that any set bounded above has a sharp upper bound, which plays a key role in proving fundamental theorems of analysis." He explained each axiom in detail, gave examples, explained the historical context, and even talked about the debates of past mathematicians who tried to build a logical basis for analysis. When he finished, the audience looked at each other. Nobody expected such detail and certainty. Professor Clark nodded reluctantly. "Okay, let's say. Now answer. How do you explain the difference between a formal proof and an intuitive understanding of a theorem?" Barron didn't hesitate again. Formal proof is based on strict logical rules, following certain axioms and deducing statements through a chain of logical reasoning. Intuitive understanding implies the ability to see the structure and essence of a theorem without the need to build a formal logical chain. In mathematics, both approaches are necessary. Formal rigor ensures accuracy, and intuition helps to find new ideas and simplified proofs. The students began to whisper. Someone looked at the professor, waiting for her reaction. She deliberately chose the most difficult questions, but Barron gave clear and logical answers to them. There was a hint of irritation in her eyes, but she wasn't going to lose that easily. She took a step closer, tilting her head to the side. You know a lot, Mr. Trump. That's commendable. She paused and, lowering her voice slightly, added, but mathematics is also about proofs. How about proving a well-known theorem? The professor's last attempt. She turned to the board, picked up some chalk, and wrote out a complex proof involving Lebesgue functions. Some students winced when they saw the formulas. Even for an advanced level, it was too much. She turned to Barron and said with a smirk, prove it. No hints. Someone in the audience gasped quietly. Everyone understood, this was a real challenge. But Barron just nodded. He stepped forward, looked at the board, took the chalk and began to write. There were no pauses, no hitches. He clearly, step by step, built logical chains, applied the necessary theorems, and derived intermediate results. Some students leaned forward in disbelief. He didn't just decide, he understood every action, demonstrating his analytical mind. A few minutes later he finished writing the last equation, put a period, put down the chalk and turned to the professor. The proof is complete. Professor Clark walked up to the board and began checking his work. 1 minute. 2. 3. There were no mistakes. There was absolute silence in the audience. Some students even stopped breathing as they watched the professor stare silently at the board and then turn his gaze to Barron. She couldn't believe what was happening. This guy didn't just turn out to be good, he proved that he knew the subject at the level of a teacher. She remained silent, her lips pressed together as if she were trying to find some kind of objection. But he wasn't there. Barron nodded slowly, turned around, and calmly sat back down in his seat. At that moment, one of the students began to applaud. There is another one behind him. And one more thing. Within seconds, the entire audience was standing and applauding. It was not just respect, it was recognition of victory. The professor understood that she had lost. But she wasn't going to leave without one last blow. She raised her hand, calling for the students to calm down. When the applause died down, she said coldly, "Okay, Mr. Trump. You've proven that you understand math." She paused and added, "But in life, mathematics is far from everything. Let's talk about politics." A tense silence fell over the audience. Now she moved on to the main goal, to touch his father. But Barron was ready for anything. There is a tense silence in the audience. Barron had just mastered the math problems with confidence and given flawless theoretical answers. He had defeated all attempts by Professor Clark to embarrass him. But now she has moved on to her main attack. "Mathematics is certainly an interesting subject," she said, smiling reservedly. "But let's not forget that our university educates not only scientists, but also future leaders." She paused, deliberately emphasizing her next words. "And governing a country is perhaps the most complex equation that cannot be solved by numbers alone. Does that sound familiar to you, Mr. Trump?" A light hum swept through the hall. Some students tensed, others looked at each other curiously. Everyone understood that now it was not just about education, but about politics, about Barron's name, about his family. But Barron didn't show that he was offended. He calmly looked up at the professor and said, "I'm open to any questions. Go ahead." Professor Clark came closer and, crossing her arms, asked the first question. "Let's say the government passes a law that restricts freedom of speech on social media. What part of the U.S. Constitution would be violated, and why would this law be inconsistent with the fundamental rights of citizens?" That was a good question. She clearly hoped that Barron would falter and forget the details, since even law students couldn't always give a precise answer right away. But he did not hesitate. "The first clause of the Bill of Rights is the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution," he began confidently. "It guarantees freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and freedom of expression. Any attempt by the government to regulate speech on social media, unless it directly calls for violence or threats, will be considered a violation of this amendment." He paused and added, "The U.S. Supreme Court has repeatedly ruled that digital platforms are modern spaces for expression, and therefore government censorship efforts can be deemed unconstitutional." Some students nodded. They understood that the answer was not just correct, but perfectly reasoned. But the professor was not going to give up. She frowned a little, then asked, "Okay. Then another question. What impact could the introduction of high duties on imported goods have on the economy?" Barron didn't hesitate here either. Introducing high tariffs will make imports more expensive, which could stimulate the development of local production. However, it could also lead to retaliatory sanctions from other countries, which would hurt American exports. It all depends on the balance. If tariffs are introduced too abruptly, it could cause a trade war, which would negatively affect the economy as a whole. He paused for a moment and then added, "As, for example, this has already happened in world history, including during the Great Depression, when the United States introduced the Smoot-Hawley tariff in 1930. This led to retaliatory measures from other countries and ultimately only worsened the economic crisis." A light whisper was heard in the hall. Barron didn't just answer, he provided historical context that made his argument irrefutable. Professor Clark clearly did not expect such preparation. She crossed her arms again, this time with obvious irritation. "Okay," she said. "What about the separation of powers? Why is it important that the executive, legislative, and judicial branches of government not overlap?" Barron chuckled slightly. "Professor, this is the basis of American democracy. Separation of powers is a principle laid down in the Constitution, according to which each branch of government should balance and control the others. The executive branch, the president, should not interfere with the work of the judicial system, just as Congress should not dictate to the president what laws he must sign. This is created to prevent tyranny and preserve the democratic foundations of the country." Someone even laughed quietly, because Barron's tone hinted at the obviousness of the question. But Professor Clark moved on to the main thrust. She smiled a little and finally asked the question she had been waiting for the most. "And what about governing the state? How do you assess the economic policy of your family? Do you really think that your last name does not give you any privileges?" There was a moment of tense silence. Some students felt that the professor had gone too far. But Barron didn't flinch, didn't get angry, didn't lose his cool. He stood up calmly, looked the professor straight in the eye and said, "Professor, it seems to me that we have now moved a little away from the topic of higher mathematics." A light chuckle was heard in the hall. But Barron continued, "I'm not asking you to judge me by my last name. If you don't like something about me as a student, tell me directly. If you don't like something about politics, talk about it somewhere else, with other people. But trying to humiliate me in front of the entire audience is not the best strategy." The hall froze. The professor did not expect such an answer. She was going to embarrass him, but instead he embarrassed her. At that moment, one of the students started clapping. "There is another one behind him. And one more thing." A few seconds later, the entire audience burst into applause. Professor Clark said nothing. Her plan failed. She looked at Barron, clenched her teeth, but couldn't find anything to say. Barron sat back down in his seat. The audience continued to clap because they didn't just see the president's son, they saw a young man who had proven himself worthy of respect. But he knew that he would remember this day for a long time. Applause thundered throughout the audience. Students who hadn't expected much from Barron to begin with now looked at him with admiration. Even those who held different political views had to admit that he had mastered every test Professor Clark had thrown at him. But Barron himself did not bask in the applause. He remained calm, as if it was just another lecture. Professor Clark stood motionless. She couldn't believe that the young man she was about to humiliate not only withstood the blow, but also won a complete victory. She took a deep breath, folded her hands, and pressed her lips together as she said, "I think that's enough for today." That was the only thing she could say. Some of the students quietly laughed. It was clear to everyone that she had admitted defeat, even if she didn't want to show it. The lecture is over. The students began to pack their things, But the atmosphere in the classroom was already completely different. Some shook Barron's hand, some looked at him with admiration, and some even looked away in embarrassment, because they had recently underestimated him. As he stood up, one of the students, a tall guy with glasses who was sitting in the back rows, approached him. "Dude, that was something," he said with a smile. "I thought you'd be confused, but you just blew her away." Barron shook his hand calmly. "Thank you," he replied. "I was just answering questions." "Well, yes," the student drawled, chuckling. "But I've never seen anyone put Professor Clark in her place so beautifully." Some of the students smiled and looked at each other. One of them, a fair-haired girl in a business suit, came closer and said quietly, "You're not just smart, but you can take a punch. That's worthy of respect." Barron just nodded politely, not attaching much importance to the words. At this point, Professor Clark quickly left the classroom. She didn't want to meet his eyes anymore. As Barron was heading out of the university, he was stopped by the assistant dean. "Mr. Trump, you are expected in the management office." Some students looked at each other in surprise. Barron wasn't surprised at all. "Okay, I'll go through." He headed to the administrative building and entered a spacious office where the dean of the faculty, an elderly man with a penetrating gaze, sat at a large table. "Have a seat, Mr. Trump," he said. "I've been briefed on today's session." Barron sat down, waiting for him to continue. "I heard that you had an interesting dialogue with Professor Clark." The young man looked at him calmly. "I was just answering her questions, sir." The dean narrowed his eyes, studying his reaction. Not every student can withstand such pressure and still keep a cool head. "I must say, it's impressive." He paused for a moment and then added, "Some teachers sometimes forget that their job is to teach, not to embarrass students. I think Professor Clark will reconsider his methods after this lesson." Barron nodded. "I don't hold a grudge against her. She just wanted to test me, and I gave her the answers." The dean nodded his head with a slight gesture of respect. "Still, I would like to remind you that, despite your last name, you will be treated the same as everyone else at our university." Barron replied calmly, "This is exactly what I want." The dean nodded with satisfaction. "In that case, keep up the good work, Mr. Trump. I think you have a great future ahead of you." When Barron left the office, he felt a slight sense of relief. It had been a tough day, but he knew he had not only passed the test, he had proven himself worthy of respect. But he also understood that this was only the beginning. Such situations will repeat themselves. There will always be people who want to use his last name against him, who want to humiliate him, catch him out, put him in an awkward position. But now he knew for sure. He can handle it. Because he's not just Trump's son. He is an independent person. And the world will hear about it more than once.